Hello and welcome to another programming installment from the Pueblo City County Library District. I'm Aaron Ramirez, Manager of Special Collections and Museum Services. And with me today is Veronica Toyomi Ota, and she will be presenting her presentation tonight will be tracing the history of Japanese immigration to the United States, and will examine the experiences and cultural trends of each generation of Japanese Americans from the late 1800s until today. Veronica is an educator, musician, and peace advocate from Pasadena, California. Veronica is a Yonsei, fourth-generation Japanese American of mixed descent, and is an active member in her local Japanese American community. She graduated from Tufts University with a degree in International Literary and Visual Studies, focusing on Japanese language and culture. After graduating, Veronica worked at the Japanese American National Museum and represented the Southern California Japanese American community as first princess of the 2015 Nisei Week Court. She later taught choir and middle school math in the Pasadena Unified School District, and also taught English in Japan for a year through the JET program. She's currently the Peace Camp Director and Outreach Program Coordinator at First Presbyterian Church of Altadena, and is in the process of applying to Divinity School to pursue a dual master's degree program in Divinity and Education or Social Work. She hopes these degrees will help her to develop a ministry that promotes peace, education, sustainability, and community building. Veronica, welcome.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Before I begin, I just want to thank you and also Bree Papin,
yes.
As well as the Pueblo City County Library District for giving me this wonderful opportunity to just share a little bit more about my family's history and kind of use that as a lens to look at the general history of Japanese Americans coming to Japanese people coming to America. So with that, I think I can go ahead and get started with my presentation.
Okay.
So let me get...
That's me. Here we go. All right.
Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about the generations of Japanese Americans and how it went from Japanese immigrant to American citizen. So early immigration is where we're going to start with the Issei arriving in America. Issei is the term in Japanese for first generation, and I will be using these Japanese terms to talk about the generations, so I hope you can familiarize yourself with them. And I think Issei and immigrant kind of go together well, so you can think of the Issei as the immigrant group coming to America. Now, in a discussion of immigration to the United States, I think that while there's unique things about the Japanese coming to America, there's a lot of trends of immigrants coming from around the world. So I really love this video that I'm going to show you that shows the patterns of immigration to the US from the 1820s until I think it goes to 2013. So I'm going to play this video and try to take a look and see if you can see when the Japanese start coming to America and maybe when the most Japanese people start coming to America, and just look for trends. So I'm going to start playing this. So you can see in the early 1800s, most immigration came from Europe and from our neighbors in Canada and Mexico. And the colors will get brighter as more immigrants come. And the number of dots that come over is also related to how many immigrants are coming. You'll see by 1850s and 60s, China is coming over. They're helping to build the railroads. Now we have more of Russia coming in 1870. And maybe you caught that one bubble from Japan in 1880, the 1890s. Okay, a little bit. Okay, there we go. Japan's really coming to America in the 1900s, 1910s. You can see a lot of the map is really lighting up. Now, unfortunately, as the world is kind of changing and World War II is starting to happen, we see less immigration. Also, the Great Depression affected that. So there's less immigration going on. But now that we're post-World War II, you see a lot more of the world lighting up. And by the 60s and 70s, we really see how America has come to be the melting pot that it is today. How fun is this? Just so many places, people coming from around the world to make a life for themselves in America. Okay, and it's going to wrap up in 2013. So the question we ask to kind of start this is, so what prompted the Japanese to start coming to America? And to talk about that, it's important to look at what's going on in Japan, right? Because when immigrants come over, there's usually something going on in their home country that would provoke them to want to leave and make a stake of trying to make a new life in America. So let's take a brief look at Japanese history from the 1850s to the 1900s to better understand why Japanese were coming to America. A huge event is in 1853. U.S. Commodore Perry lands in Shimazu, Shizuoka. And here is a depiction, an artist depiction of the black steamship he arrived on. He rolled in on this steamship and he really scared the heck out of the Japanese. They had never seen anything like this. He effectively ends the Sakoku era, which is about 250 years of isolation. So for about 250 years, it's kind of considered a golden age in Japan. It's the Edo period, Tokugawa shogunate, the Tokugawa samurai family is in charge. You see the samurai class, and Japanese culture is really vibrant, and they're totally isolated from the rest of the world. No trade, no contact. They've closed their borders. But when Commodore Perry comes in, he basically tells the Japanese, look, you better open up your borders or else I'm going to blow up this, I'm going to use this scary steamship and blow you guys up. So Japan is scared and they do open up their borders for the first time. So 1853, we have Commodore Perry. Now in 1854 and 55, there's a series of major earthquakes that also cause a lot of damage. By 1860, we see economic collapse. There's all this new trade from foreign countries with different currencies, and it totally messes up the Japanese market. By the 1860s, there's a lot of civil unrest. They're afraid of colonization. They've kind of seen what Europe and America has done in other countries, and they're afraid of colonization from the West. They also have a really weakened central government by this time. So in 1868, they restore Emperor Meiji to power, and it's called the Meiji Restoration. It ends the Tokugawa shogunate. There's no more samurai. If you've seen the film The Last Samurai, it's kind of about this time period. And of course, there's some inaccuracies, but it's actually got a lot of historical truth in it. So this is the end of that period of samurai, and the Meiji emperor really is dedicated to industrialization and catching up with the West. So it's a different Japan. So once you open up Japan, people are going to start leaving Japan also for the first time. So the Japanese first arrive in Hawaii in the 1880s. So Hawaii is actively recruiting the Japanese because before that, they have lots of other groups working there, and especially a lot of Chinese people. But in 1882, the United States has the Chinese Exclusion Act that stops Chinese from being allowed to come to America. So now Hawaii targets Japan. They have plantation work, a lot of sugarcane and pineapple plantations. So there's African Americans, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, and Portuguese workers all on these plantations. And they really wanted to keep these groups segregated, and they did not want them to unify because they were worried if they got together that they would overthrow the plantations. So there's a lot of segregation and pay disparity. They actually had little badges that each ethnic group had to wear. So like if you're Japanese, you had to wear a round badge, and if you're Chinese, you had to wear a square. And when it came time for payday, you'd go up and you're Japanese, you show your circle badge and maybe you get $3. And then if you're Chinese, you show your square badge and you got $4. These are made up numbers, but it actually was different pay with a tag depicting what race you were. So it wasn't ideal situation out there. When you look at the Hawaiian population in 1853, 97% of the population were indigenous Hawaiian people. But only 70 years later, by 1923, it's only 16% indigenous, and the majority population is actually Japanese. And my great-grandparents were some of the people who made up this Japanese population. They came over to Hawaii probably in the 1900s or 1910s. They were from a farming family in Hiroshima, and they were hoping for better luck out in Hawaii. And my great-grandfather was also Christian, so he was looking for some of the religious freedom in America. But life was tough in Hawaii. Those plantations were not forgiving. I've heard a story that my great-grandmother, so this is a picture of my family, my great-grandmother there supposedly was pregnant with my grandpa, gave birth to him in like the birthing cottage, some little place, and then 2 days later was back out on the fields picking on the plantation. So life was tough. They also had 2 daughters that were older, and they both died from typhoid fever in Hawaii. So it was really tough out there. And more people start moving to the mainland, the West Coast of America. So again, the West Coast also has a need for immigrant labor because the Chinese have been excluded. So in the 1900s, we see a huge increase in Japanese coming to the American West. The Issei immigrants are working on the farms, they're working railroads, mines, canneries, factories, very labor intensive jobs. So again, this is just a photo of my family, probably from the late 1930s or so. I want to talk a little bit about the anti-Asian sentiment and legislation that was going on at this time. Because again, it's very important to see what our government was doing in response to these waves of immigration. So the Nationality Acts of 1790 and 1870. So in 1790, people who were free whites could become naturalized citizens. They could apply for citizenship. So that means immigrants from Europe could apply to become citizens. By 1870, it was expanded to people of African nativity and descent. So there's nothing said about Asians at this point. So it's kind of a gray area whether or not Asians are allowed to become naturalized citizens. In 1882, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act that I mentioned that stopped Chinese from coming over and straight up said Chinese cannot become naturalized citizens. So again, there's a loophole. What about Japanese? Well, there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment when they start coming over. So legislators call for a Japanese Exclusion Act. They come to a compromise in 1908 with the Gentleman's Agreement, which says no more men can come over, but women who are going to be wives, children, and other family can immigrate, which is when we see the advent of picture brides, which was Japanese women would take photos of themselves and agencies would, men in America, Japanese men in America would look at these photos of Japanese women, pick a bride based on their picture, and then they'd come over to America. So by 1913, there's still a lot of anti-Japanese and anti-Asian sentiment. So California specifically makes the California Alien Land Law, which says that non-citizens are not allowed to own property in California. In 1922, Ozawa versus the United States Supreme Court case, Ozawa tries to say that, tries to become a naturalized citizen, but the Supreme Court rules that he is racially ineligible for citizenship in 1922. By 1924, there's the Immigration, the Immigration Act, which sets a quota for how many immigrants from each country are allowed to come over to America. And it's not until 1952 that the Immigration and Nationality Act abolishes racial restrictions for citizenship. So that's a lot of years where Asians were not allowed to become citizens. But since we've talked about the Issei experience a little bit, now we can move on to the first generation that's born in America, the Nisei. So Issei is the first generation, which are the immigrants that came over. Nisei means second generation. It's a little confusing, but it's the first generation that are born in the United States. They're the first generation of US citizens. So, and a picture of an Issei and Nisei on the left here. This is my grandma's side. So this is my great-grandmother and my grandma. So my great-grandmother would be an Issei, and my grandma was Nisei, born in America. The Issei immigrants are really successful farmers. They take over, they bring over Japanese farming techniques, and they're really successful. So by the 1920s, more than 10% of the crop revenue in California is being produced by Japanese farmers, which obviously creates some tension with the farmers, the American farmers who were there before. The Issei can't own land, so they put their land often in the name of their children, the Nisei, or some of them also who had friends who were citizens, they would ask them to put the land in their names. A little note about the Nisei, because it's important to note that there's some differences in the culture of Nisei. So we're going to talk about the Nisei and the Kibei. So the Nisei really are like most other first-generation American children born to immigrant parents. Their nationality is American. They're born in the US. Their language, their first language is Japanese at the home, but they speak English in school. And so their culture, they have traditional Japanese values, but they also adopt aspects of American culture. They want to dress like their friends. They want to, do the same sports and games and talk like their friends. So it's kind of a division. It's a divided identity. The Kibei is a word for a type of Nisei that were born in America, but their family sent them back to Japan for education. So these are families who identify more with the Japanese culture. Japan is the motherland for them, and they plan to go back to Japan someday. So just to have a visual of this, here's a Nisei baseball group, and you can see that these boys here, there's an American flag, there's a Japanese flag. They're trying to enjoy the American pastime of baseball. And here's a Kibei kids in Japan, and really they look like Japanese people, but they're Japanese American who are going to Japan for their schooling. And unfortunately, some of these children were in Japan when the war started and had to deal with the suffering that Japan endured during World War II. But that's a conversation for itself. But it's important to note that there was this division of feeling American or wanting to be American or still feeling tied to Japanese roots. By the 1930s, the Japanese American community is really established. There's baseball teams and Boy Scouts, Buddhist temples, Christian churches, although at this time they're mostly segregated. They're not really welcomed into white churches. There are festivals and holidays that are celebrated. And we still see the Japanese cultural traditions of odori dance, martial arts like karate and judo, ikebana flower arrangement, tea ceremony. These are part of the Japanese American community. There's also Japanese markets and shops and restaurants. And so here's a really fun tradition that kind of got mentioned in my introduction a little bit. So this is Nisei Week, which is a festival held in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles every year. It was started in 1935, and it's just a really fun cultural summer festival where we celebrate Japanese heritage. You can see it was really thriving. On the top right are the Queen and Court, and so I was a participant in 2015 as the first princess in our court. So this is a tradition we're really proud of. It's the longest running ethnic festival in the United States. Obviously, it did take a break during World War II, but it's a point of pride that our community came back together and reestablished Nisei Week in 1949. So the point of this is that the community was really vibrant in the 1930s. Unfortunately, that all changed on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. In light of this, 2 months later, President FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which basically gave the Secretary of War the right to prescribe certain areas as military zones, which would be under martial law. This made the way so that more than 120,000 people of Japanese descent in this West Coast region were put into camps. So this includes the Issei immigrants, who again were not allowed to become citizens, so they were immigrants. The Nisei, US foreign citizens who are being denied their rights to due process. And some of the third generation Sansei are even born at this time, and their rights are not considered. And all these people, including the elderly, including people who are sick, including orphans who don't even know their Japanese parents, but if they have Japanese blood, they were assembled, relocated, and incarcerated for the duration of the war. Any conversation about Japanese American history is incomplete without talking about the World War II experience of being in camp. That's a big topic unto itself, but I do want to touch upon it today as it's very important to the Japanese American experience. So let's take a look at what life was like in camp. To begin with, this is a delicate subject to be talking about, and there is controversy over the labels of how we talk about camp. The government referred to them as relocation camps or internment. Now, in many ways, these are euphemisms because they soften the reality of what these camps really were. The Japanese American National Museum and many other organizations refer to them as America's concentration camps, because by definition, they're concentrating a group of people based on their ethnicity. Now, of course, this is not to be confused with the death camps, where unfortunately the Holocaust was carried out and killed so many people of Jewish descent and other minority groups. My personal preference, I like to refer to them as incarceration camps, because when my grandfather talked to me about camp, he would always talk about it that he was behind barbed wire fences and there were guns pointed at him, and it very much felt like imprisonment. So to me, incarceration seems the most appropriate, but you will hear different terms being used. And here's a photo that my grandmother had taken of the Rohr Relocation Center where they were incarcerated during World War II. So here's a map of, to talk a little bit about the internment. So this pink area on the side is the exclusion area. So that's the, where the Secretary of War said, if you are Japanese, you have to show up to an assembly center, and then they were sent to these camps, which are located with stars. And you can see my family was sent to Rohr, Arkansas, which is the farthest east, but they're in very rural, desolate places where there's nothing really going on. The climate is very different depending on where you are. But before the camps were completed, because they had to build these camps suddenly for 120,000 people, before the camps were ready, they actually sent people to assembly centers. And so my family was sent to the Santa Anita racetrack, which is in Arcadia, California. It's one of the largest assembly centers. And my family had to live in a horse stall for half a year or so. And at that time, my grandparents weren't married or maybe didn't really know each other. So it's my adult grandfather, 25 years old, his brother, who must have been about 22, and their two adult parents in a horse stall. They were sanitized, quote unquote, with a fire hose before they got there. But it was really dehumanizing to have to live in a racetrack. Then one day they were told, pack up the things you could carry again and get on this train and go somewhere new. And they went on a train with blacked out windows, and they didn't know where they were going. And they ended up in Rohr, Arkansas. So life in camp for those 3 years, some people didn't stay all that long, but the majority were from 1942 to 45. Experience varied greatly depending on the age and which camp you're in. So if we think about the generations, well, the Issei were the oldest group. They're adults, some of them are elderly, and they lost all their land, their homes, their businesses, their careers, everything they had worked hard to establish for themselves in America was, for the most part, most people lost everything. The Nisei, who are American citizens, well, they're mostly young adults. Some are children at this time. So the thing most impacted for them was their quality and access to education. And some of them, because they're young, even have fond memories of camp because they didn't have to go to school. They could be with their friends. They could run around. It was a different experience depending on who you were. My grandfather was Nisei, and as I mentioned, he was in his mid-20s, and it totally destroyed the possibility of his career as a professional athlete. So, it also devastated many of the Nisei or left a strong, emotional scars for them. There are some Sansei, third generation, very few, and some of them are actually born in camp. Life goes on. And as I mentioned, the camp placement depended greatly. Some camps are stricter. There's the Tule Lake Isolation Center. At the Tule Lake camp, people who were deemed the biggest threat of being spies or who didn't show loyalty to America, they were sent to Tule Lake. Also, you can consider the weather and climate as a factor of, if you're a Californian and you end up in Manzanar, California, okay, it's a little colder. But if you're a Californian and you end up in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, it's a totally different climate. Roar, Arkansas, the swamps were very different for my family. So now we'll talk a little bit about the general hardships shared by everyone in camp. There's no privacy. You got multiple families to a barrack, which is that long building. They try to put up like curtains and things for privacy, but really at the end of the day, it was embarrassing to live in that kind of style. There's also the bathroom and shower facilities, which were separate. There were no walls. So it was a line with holes for the toilets, and you use the restroom, and every once in a while, a bunch of water would wash through and wash everything away. But there's no privacy. As for the school supplies, there really aren't any. There's not enough teachers. The mess hall dining was really horrible. If you ask a lot of the people who survived camp, you say like, oh, what was camp like? And they're like, well, the food was horrible. That's like the first thing they always say. So the food was bad, and there was no family meals. It was just one big mess hall. Some people were able to work, but at very low, unfair pay. And there was actually a military draft. So after a little while, they put out a loyalty questionnaire that men had to answer to talk about if they were loyal to the United States and if they would fight for the United States. And many young men did prove their loyalty, and they were drafted out of camp. And to this day, the most decorated military unit for its size is the segregated Japanese American 442nd Military Brigade. A lot of the guys were sent to fight in Europe, and they were often put on the front lines because they weren't thought of as important as other soldiers, but they really proved their loyalty. And one hardship we see overall is really just the degradation of the family unit and the family values and their lifestyle and way of living. So now I'll show a video, a short video from Heart Mountain that just talks a little bit about some people's experience. And I love some of the footage. I think it's really helpful to see what it was like. So this is footage from Heart Mountain in Wyoming.
Yes, the first winter was very cold. Coldest winter, I believe, in Wyoming history. And naturally, we were from California, where it's warmer. And a lot of people from the Los Angeles area, well, they just came with a shirt and the jeans, and they got the shock of their lives when it's so cold.
You could go to the bathroom. If you had to go, you had to go. So whether it's storming or whatever, you ran out of your barrack. And when you got there was icicles coming out of your nose.
And here you can see coal that they would bring in on a train. That was the way people kept warm. Some people's job was to help shovel the coal out, and they drive it down to the different barracks. This guy would say, "Hey, the coal's here." And everybody would go out to try to find the biggest piece of coal because that would last the longest. And you can see everybody was in on trying to get the coal. There's kids, there's men, women. She got a good piece. Yeah, and some of the kids here taking coal back to their barrack. Now, if you're heating somewhere with coal and fire, you're going to have some fires. So unfortunately, fires did break out in camp. And here you can see men from their firefighter unit helping put out this fire. And everybody's like going to go watch the fire. What else are you going to do? And here you can see they have some EMTs.
We had a shortage of material and books. Only 50 American history texts for 300 pupils. The books had to be passed on to the next class because of the shortage. Up to 65 students were crowded into the small barracks classrooms. There were benches, no desks, and a piece of painted masonite for a blackboard.
Yeah, so supplies were short, but you know, the power of human resilience, people making the best of every situation. Here they made a baseball diamond. They're playing baseball. They could order some items out of Sears catalogs and different things. And after a while, they could get things from town. Here's a sumo wrestling match. So still celebrating culture. Oh, is he going to get him? Oh, down he goes. You can see here, they're still doing traditional activities like dance. The kids here are performing. And how beautiful. They've painted this wonderful set and they've gotten fabric and made these costumes themselves. Mochitsuki, which is traditionally a New Year's tradition, making mochi. Again, the Nisei are known for being really handy because a lot of them made this stuff. They had to figure out using the materials that they had. You see everybody's in on the mochi making. Okay. So camp, you know, there's a lot of hardship and a lot of that isn't even talked about. It's not really a Asian or Japanese thing to be open about your emotions of hardship, especially. But I think the real beauty is the perseverance and the resilience that you see of these folks who are in these camps. And here's a photo of my grandma's family. My grandma's on the bottom right, and then her sisters are up front. And you can see her brother Kanji in the back there. He was in the service. And, you know, here they are dressing up, trying to make the best of these situations. And I think that really is a beautiful part of the Japanese American story and the experience of camp. So of course, life went on. So let's talk a little bit about life after camp, especially for the Sansei, Yonsei, and Gosei generations. So when they were leaving camp, they were given a train ticket and $25. That was it. Most of them didn't have a home anymore. They didn't have jobs or businesses to return to. They were also told if they went back, especially in California, if they returned to California, that they would be killed. So the Ota family, and actually the largest population of Japanese, end up in Denver, Colorado, of all places, after the war. Now, this isn't all that surprising because the Colorado governor, Ralph Carr, was the only Western governor who was opposed to internment. He was a lawyer, and he knew that it was really not, it was breaking their constitutional rights to due process, that it was wrong to imprison these people. So even before the internment, he welcomed Japanese Americans to Colorado. And after the war, a lot of people felt safe going to Colorado. Now, unfortunately, his support of Japanese American rights is what eventually lost his political career. But he stood up for what he believed in and created a place for many Japanese to feel safe. And actually, my aunt was born in Denver, Colorado, before my family came back to Los Angeles. Which brings us to the Sansei third generation. So most of these Sansei are baby boomers. So their first language is English. A lot of them were made to attend Japanese school on Saturdays, but they're very Americanized on the whole. You know, they're growing up in America in the 60s and 70s with everything going on in this country. So there's like the civil rights movement, and people are really starting to come to this idea of what an Asian American identity means, what the Asian American community is, and yeah, really importantly, what this identity is. And this is happening amidst the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And Sansei are really getting involved in social activism as part of civil rights, anti-Vietnam War protesting. Many people were involved in that. There was also the call for redress so that the government would acknowledge the wrong that sending people to camp. So in 1988, finally, there is redress. $20,000 is given to the survivors of the World War II internment. This is unfortunate because by 1988, so many of the Issei had died already. Probably definitely the majority of them. So the people who lost the most never really got to see acknowledgement, and they never saw, this money given to them in light of what was done to them. But something is better than nothing. And even recently, we see California has officially apologized for the internment and incarceration of Japanese and Japanese Americans during the war. So it's great that there's recognition. And I love this photo. This is a photo of my dad. After the Sansei come the Yonsei generation, which is fourth generation, like me. And there's even Gosei, fifth generation. And to be honest, I don't know what comes after that. Maybe someone else does, or maybe this is an open-ended conversation. But the Yonsei and Gosei there's a lot of biracial and mixed kids who are Yonsei, like myself. And now we see the formation of the Nikkei community, which is people of Japanese descent. So the original Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, Gosei, but also people who came over later, because of course, after the war and at different years and different times, people have come since in different times, and they're all part of the Nikkei community. For these later generations, we see that Japanese American culture and community is really being retained through organizations like Japanese American National Museum, the Japanese American Citizens League, and also the availability of educational resources. There's also a bunch of Nikkei basketball groups, sports groups, Buddhist temple church groups. There's still a Japanese school, and we still have cultural festivals like Nisei Week. You could see the court that I was a part of up there. And so we see kind of a return to our roots. I think we are proud to celebrate everything that our families have endured to be proud to be Japanese American today. And so here's just a list of references. I'm sorry, I'm not a librarian, so these are probably not in great formatting, but thank you so much for listening. Let me end my screen share.
Now, as a librarian, we completely appreciate the references and the citations. And so people can play this back. No, you're doing great. And people can play it back and get those references and citations if they'd like. David Hirotsu says Rokusei for the sixth generation.
That could be it, David. I was thinking Rokusei or Rosei, but that's kind of weird. But your Japanese is better than mine, so his Japanese.
And Fuji Design says, yes, I've heard the term Rokusei used.
Oh.
Say what? And so each generation it describes the generation. It's named after the generation, but then does it also have an alternate meaning to coincide? So let's say Rokusei, what would that translate to?
So that would just be the number 6. generation. So all of them are just issei means one, ni, ichi, ni, san, yon, go, roku. So it's really just counting the generations.
I see. Excellent. Yes, I learned. So as this program is part of an exhibit of Frank Denichi Muramoto, was a Japanese man who lived here in Pueblo, and we were translating pictures, descriptions, and it turned out that Kai, Kai, means club, and Karate Kid, you have Cobra Kai, and now they have that series, and I did not know that Kai meant club. So
there you go.
Very interesting. But Jamie says, excellent presentation, Miss Veronica, exclamation. So
oh, thanks, Jamie. Thanks for listening in. So sweet.
big kudos there. Yes, fantastic presentation, Veronica. So last week we were talking to Robin Lawrence from here in Colorado from Colorado, north of us from Colorado Springs, and I asked him this question. So I'll ask you: in Bill Hosokawa's Colorado's Japanese Americans from 1886 to the present, he cites a Dr. James Taguchi, who was a Colorado-born physician, and in that, Taguchi is commenting on what is Japanese culture or character, I guess. And so he mentions several principles, I guess, or aspects of being, and included are in that as shinsetsu, kindness, ishokinmai, to do one's best, and then gambaru, to hang tough or to persist. And I was wondering if in your experience, you've lived here in Japan, and then growing up in your family, does that resonate with you, or how would you apply that today with all the things going on?
I definitely think those terms are really relevant. I've heard gambaru, probably the most common. Gambaru is like got this, go get 'em. It's kind of hard to translate, but kind of this rallying thing, and there's a lot of strength in gambaru. But I like hearing shinsetsu, which is like kindness. I think Japanese are known for being super polite and kind. Ishokenmei, that's a really good one. I don't think that's used as much like in outside of the circle, but ishokenmei, doing everything with everything you got, putting all your heart into it. I definitely think that's a super Japanese trait that was passed into our Japanese American culture. I think it's been interesting to live in Japan and see what aspects really resonate with me. Like, oh, this is like the Japanese American family and culture I grew up with, or some things that are really different that have changed, or changed because we're in America, or changed because Japan has changed. But I think shinsetsu, ishokenmei, gambaru, and one that I would add that my grandfather always used was shikata ga nai. And that's a term that kind of means like it can't be helped, or there's nothing you can do. And it's kind of to try to make the most of a tough situation, like something bad. Well, shikata ga nai. Man, there's nothing we can do. But I think because there's this feeling of, okay, there's nothing I can do, then you can gaman, which is to persevere and move through that. And I think shikata ga nai was the situation of camp. They were in a bad situation, but they persevered and were kind and worked as hard as they could. And I'm really proud of those traits.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. So we have some comments in the chat. Nafa Reddy says, thank you for the great presentation from a former Nisei Week Prince, 1983. Fantastic. Hi, Nafa. Electra Matsushita. Great job, Veronica. Especially loved all the personal Ota family photos. Fuji Design says, will this program be available for viewing after the live stream? Yes, Fuji Design. It will be archived here on our YouTube channel, as well as through our the Rawlings Library Facebook page. Matsushita then says, how would you say the Japanese American experience has resonated with you, and what do you see its legacy being within the context of America?
Ooh, I'm on the hot seat, Electra. Oh man, Electra works at the Japanese American National Museum. We work there together. And she is just a great member of the Japanese American community, working so hard to educate others and keep the museum alive. The Japanese American experience definitely, I think the most profound impact it's had on my life is my sense of justice and my awareness that you have to be vigilant, you have to be aware of what's going on, and you have to see injustice and call it out for what it is. Because, you know, my family was just living their life and they lost years of it and who knows what else, simply because of the color of their skin. I think this conversation is still relevant, obviously, with what we got going on with Black Lives Matter and other, finally talking about systemic racism. That's why I tried to bring up those legislative points, that we have laws in place that are racist, and we need to look at them seriously and talk about them, and have people of all different colors also talk about them. So I think, yeah, being Japanese American, and thankfully that my grandfather talked about his experience to me, really informed my sense of justice. And I know that I have to try to make this world a more just place, and more, and extend understanding to people, and yeah, just try my best in those aspects.
Absolutely. We have Shikata Ganai,
Oh, yeah.
such a strong Japanese concept, says David Hirotsu. Personally, it has a tone of surrender to the powers outside of the individual outside of individual control. So that stoicism and that serenity prayer. See very strong parallels there.
Yeah, and I think that's something, especially with the pandemic, that we can try to learn from. Like, when things are outside of our control, what isn't, like figuring out like the serenity prayer, what is under our control? What can we have the courage to work on? But also, what do we need to learn to accept so that we can move forward and find serenity, find peace? And yeah, thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you, David. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. So you're, speaking of craziness and everything is happening right now, you're in California, correct?
Yeah.
And so that's, you guys are locked down for COVID, is that right? How is that going?
Yes, unfortunately, the situation, especially in Southern California, is really dire. And I heard the statistic 1 out of 5, and more recently, I even heard 1 out of 3 people have COVID. And I'd like to take this opportunity to actually share that I started feeling sick on Monday, and I have tested positive for COVID. I want to take away the shame that goes with that, but also educate people. And I think there's still people out there who don't believe COVID exists. And there are a lot of people also who think it exists, but might not think it's as severe as it is. A lot of people don't necessarily know someone who has it. So, hi, I have tested positive. I'm really, really lucky and grateful that my symptoms are very minor. You might be able to hear some congestion. I had a headache and fatigue and whatnot, and this cough and congestion. I'm really lucky though. And since I have this platform to share with people, I just encourage you all, don't get tired of staying vigilant. Continue to wear masks, stay at home. It's every decision that can make the difference of your health and safety and everyone you encounter. And so I can't change the fact that I caught this, but if I can help tell people that it's real and that staying at home really makes a difference, I hope I can do that. And on a slightly more positive note, I wanted to share that the Japan Foundation New York is working with the global, the Center for Global Partnership, and they're doing a mask a design competition. And so a way to make masks more positive and encourage creativity, you have until next week. And basically, yeah, it's just a fun way to design this a mask. And I believe they're going to have they're going to award certain people. So it's a lot of fun. And I hope you might consider participating, because I think we need to change this culture around mask wearing. In Japan, they wear masks whenever they're sick, because it's a way to respect others, and you know you're sick, like don't spread it. So I hope that after this pandemic, we can also incorporate masks more frequently, so that we're just being more respectful and trying to keep everyone safe. So yeah, Aaron, if you'd be able to share some of that information with folks. Oh, nice. It's on the chat.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. And Fuji Design wishes you a speedy recovery, and thanks for sharing the experience, your experience.
Thanks, everyone.
And urging you to enter the mask contest. Well, thank you for sharing not only your most recent experiences, and I'm glad that you were able to join us tonight. I really appreciate you sharing everything. So thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you for participating with us and joining us this evening. So
thank you so much. It's really been an honor, and I've been looking forward to this. And I'm stuck in my room 6 more days, so this was very exciting to get to connect, at least virtually, with people.
Yes, you're worldwide now, stuck in your room. So that's wonderful, and thanks again, and we'll see you next time, I guess. I don't know.
Thank you, and good luck with the rest of this series.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone.